And I want to bring in my all-star panel. We've gone head-to-head before on this subject. I want to find out if any of them have changed their minds. Joining me now is Conservative radio host Dana Lash, Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, and a board member of the NRA, and Democratic strategist Marjorie Clifton. Welcome to you all again. We had a pretty heated debate last week about guns, and it's still at the top of the agenda. We had this extraordinary outpouring of tributes and sympathy from all the baseball teams today, a very united front. But of course the political debate isn't remotely united. Let me ask you first, Dana, we had a pretty civilized discussion today on your radio show, but when you hear a man like Tom Teves speak so eloquently and just desperate for something to happen, what do you say to him?
Oh, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, as I have children myself, and as a mother, this is one of the things, Piers, that they didn't tell you about parenthood, that you see your child and every other child out there. And I was live on air when Newtown was unfolding, and it was the most difficult broadcast I ever had to get through in my entire life. And I just kept thinking, what could be done? What does someone do in a situation like this? And certainly in hindsight, everyone's always an expert, aren't they? They think that there's so many different things, from the law enforcement to elected officials. They think there's something that could have been done, red flags that could have been caught. And that's where I really think that we need to focus this. I mean, you and I talked today on my program that there are all of these incidents that have happened just, in the past year. They all have a common denominator here. You have men who are, young men who are estranged from society in some fashion. Every single one of them are on psychotropic drugs. And yet we have very little to no conversation about this at all whatsoever. And certainly I think that there need to be some reforms done to the mental health community in that particular area to address this. But we need to start having a broad conversation. And we also appear to be very careful that we don't stigmatize people with mental illness and make it to where people who have mental illnesses feel as though there's now a hurdle in their way to identify that and seek treatment. But we have to have a national discussion on this. It's time.
Okay, Grover Norquist, I mean, I agree with all of that. And, when we spoke on Dana's radio show today, we actually found a few points of genuine agreement, which is the way this debate has to go. But what I feel so disheartened by is the sort of nagging sense now, and people begin to write this openly in all the major newspapers, that nothing significant may happen at all. In fact, quite the contrary. 26 states at the moment in America are actively seeking to expand gun rights. Not to limit them in any way, but to expand them. Now, you're a board member of the NRA. Do you really think, in your heart, that the correct response of a great nation like America to an appalling atrocity like Sandy Hook is to race to sell more guns, more ammunition, and to expand gun rights?
Well, first of all, the murderer in Colorado who killed 12 people should be executed 12 times. You had the conversation about whether what should happen to the murderer. I think he should be executed at least once. Now, we should ask ourselves, what should we do that would help? What should we do is not the question. What should we do that would make things better? What we know from science, what we know from history, what we know from the experience in Britain is that when you pass gun restriction laws, crime increases rather than decreases. It happened in Australia.
Yeah, but Grover,
it happened in the United States.
Grover, I can't let you keep repeating that without pointing out that I would imagine most viewers watching this would happily settle for their home being burgled over being shot in the head and killed. There is a significant difference between being robbed or burgled and being murdered. And you have to accept that. America has a shocking rate of gun murder and gun suicide, worse than the other 22 richest countries in the world combined.
Okay, when you compare a state or a country, and if you pass laws to restrict gun ownership, as they had in Colorado, you couldn't have a gun in that theater. That was against the law. When you restrict gun laws, you end up with more crime and more murders, not less. And we have 50 states we can compare. When you've passed laws to make it easier for honest citizens to carry concealed, crime, murders, rapes have declined compared to states like Chicago, like Illinois, where you have more gun laws. So the more gun laws you pass restricting gun rights, the more crime you get. The more honest citizens have availability of owning guns, the less crime you have. That's true in the United States, state by state. It's true in Britain. From the law that they passed restricting gun laws, you had more crime rather than less. Australia, the same thing.
Okay.
So let's look for what works. Let's look at what works.
Okay, let's go to Marjorie Clifton. Let me just point out again that both in Australia and Britain, the key difference is the gun death rate is absolutely minuscule. So you can bang on about people being, you know, victims of crime, but they're not being victims of gun crime. And what we're specializing here is gun crime. Marjorie Clifton, let me ask you first of all about the death penalty element of what I discussed with Tom Tees. He felt very strongly that if the Aurora shooter, James Holmes, is found guilty, he should be executed. Grover wants him executed 12 times, and that's an emotional reaction, which many may well agree with. What do you feel, Marjorie? Because, well, Marjorie, your mother runs an anti-death penalty coalition.
Yes, she runs the Catholic Mobilizing Network, and she works actually with a lot of the pro-life community to focus on the death penalty is actually one of the pro-life issues of our time. And I think, you know, there were some important things that happened here. That the challenge is that use of the death penalty doesn't bring that person back. And absolutely, it's natural. All the things that he's feeling, the hurt in his heart, you know, that eye for an eye instinct we have. But if you look at it from even a perspective of faith, it's about, you know, what can we do in terms of restorative justice? And this is actually something that Pope Francis is talking a lot about right now, which also it's touched on. What are we doing in terms of mental health? What are we doing for the people who are committing these crimes, who a lot of times are victims of similar crimes themselves, of abuse? Now, if you look at even the fiscal issue of the death penalty, and the death penalty is not something that's actually broadly talked about, but when it is, actually the majority of Americans do not support its use because there's a couple of problems. Only 10 to 15% of death penalty cases actually use DNA evidence in those cases, and only 90% of people who go on death row have representation, which means that the death penalty is skewed a lot towards minority and poor populations that they're convicted of the death penalty. But the bigger issue, and this is something Grover should care a lot about, is the fiscal issue. You look at the state of California. Since 1978, it has cost the state $4 billion to use the death penalty for only 13 people. And the average person, by the way, sits on death row for about 20 years. And, you know, the challenge with this is that if we eradicated the death penalty in California right now, we would gain $170 million a year. And right now, the money for the use of the death penalty is coming directly out of the education funds. So there's a direct line to, you know, how we're actually caring for people by use of education, and that direct line to prison that's happening. So we need to think of this from a fiscal issue. You know, is it bringing anything back? No, it's not. And by the way, it isn't a deterrent. It's a proven non-deterrent for people who use violent crime.
Okay, look, hold that thought. I actually want to come both to Grover and to Dana after break on the specific point about death penalty I want to raise, which is this issue of DNA testing now, in which 8 people on death row have been exonerated by DNA since 1999. That has to change the debate on the death penalty. Let's talk about that and a number of other hot political issues, including the White House Easter egg roll. We can afford